Nathan, how would you say human thought or human thinking has either supported us or separated us from the world?
Well, that's kind of the thing that separates the men from the beasts, I guess. So it's a important subject. The thing that humans are so famous for, maybe above all things, is probably technology. We have these big old frontal lobes on our brain, especially on the left side here, that's capable of abstract thought. We can see a thing before it exists and then know what to do to make it exist. We can make a tool, we can make a building, we can do, we can create and not just react, but create new novel things. We have the ability of novel thought, and that's easily our greatest strength as a species. It's amazing, and if harnessed well, and when harnessed well, it can be wonderful for the environment as well. Humans for a long time, this is basically what permaculture is, engineered the environment to be more productive, and not more productive for just the humans, but productive for everything. When good things happen is kind of a good saying to go by. It's if you're in an environment that's pumping, then it's going to be a lot easier for you to find your niche within it. So, but what we have kind of gone and done with that is overdevelop the abstract capabilities that our minds have to the point to where we can exist almost completely within them. We don't have to go out, or we think we don't have to go out and interact with the rain and with animals and with each other in a honest to God, genuine, authentic experience. And it's impossible to act appropriately from that place, all mind and no heart, all ideas and no connection, and all nature and no man, or man and nature as being two separate things instead of the same thing, which they are. And you cannot be a competent land steward, father, parent, lover, anything, if you're not actually experiencing what is happening. And that's the state that our culture has pretty much gone into. No individual can completely escape that. There are times when, despite our walls and roof and ability to careen through the world at 70 miles per hour in a car, is the real world still gets imposed on us, and we need to be open to those moments and go looking for them. I'm still light years away from where I would like to be with my own nature connection, and that's probably how I'll die, because I grew up in the suburbs, and I haven't yet. That's not totally true. I don't have to do that to survive, and the rest of the world does. If you don't experience humility when you go into the world to make your living, and you don't have to worry about working or applying yourself to stay warm, to stay fed, to make sure your children are safe, you're not going to be as connected as you could be. And even in those situations, you can be so wrapped up in fear, or some idea that is overriding your ability to connect with what's really going on around you, that you still won't make that leap. And that's where I think humility, empathy becomes the most important skill.
It's interesting to me that you bring up very spiritual concepts like humility, and it's connected to how people live their lives within or outside of nature.
Yeah, yeah. I'll take an example of one of these. You know, I also teach disaster preparedness, and there's in a sense at least two human brains, and when a disaster happens, those frontal lobes, especially on the left side, shuts off. We become a big shaved monkey at that point. Our capacity for novel thought and abstract thinking is turned off completely. If you're in a vehicle that's flipping end over end, you don't need to be doing math problems and thinking things through. You need to react immediately. And our own physiology recognizes that and turns off that part of our brain in those situations. And I remember I was speaking with a friend who was through one of the more massive San Francisco quakes some decades ago, and she said people just stammered around like zombies. They just couldn't believe what was going on around them and couldn't react to it. And that's because we have gone through life not experiencing the need to react to something. Everything's given to you. And that's why there are people who are not addicted, but they're drawn to climbing mountains and riding motorcycles and sailing around the world. We need that in our self in order to know who our self is. And in order to find ourselves, we want to be challenged by those things so that when we're the person in that car that's flipping over and we dislocate a shoulder, we're going to be able to react to it. And people think, oh, that's like a Hollywood thing. No. Disasters happen to every person. They do. And your ability or inability to react to that is really going to affect how the rest of your days go. But so I think that a big part of, well, I'll just leave it at that. But human thought, it has its limitations and it has its strengths, and it's not the right tool for every job. A hammer is a fantastic tool if I'm building a house, but I can't eat a bowl of cereal with it. And we tend to do everything with our mind, and we don't with the one little corner of our mind at that. And we don't draw out all these other tools that we have handy to us. And I think that is where that's where connection starts to add layers and depth.
So there's lots of people who were raised to live in that corner, that small corner of the right side of the front of their brains. Mm-hmm. If someone wants to do a switch and learn how to be more aware of the nature connections, mm-hmm. what would you say to them?
There's a term known as dirt time that people who are into bushcrafting and survival skills relate to. You can get on YouTube and you can learn how to do a bow drill fire. You can learn how to build a shelter. You can do all these things and abstractly watch it happen on a screen. But you will not understand how to do a bow drill until you've done it dozens of times in the rain. You will not have that level of competence until you do it. If you want to have a connection to nature, just like if you want to have a connection with a human being, you have to spend time there, and you have to be open, and you have to be you need to be humble, and not control the situation, not try to control the situation. Let go. And find that as a release rather than a scary thing. and find a way to become interdependent with it. And that's a big part of it. I hunt and I fish and I try to forage my own food. None of those things as much as I would like to, or would like to think I do. But you know, in India they have the cows are sacred there, and cows are sacred because a long time ago, they're sacred to the point that people don't eat them. A long time ago they got sacred because they were an important food source, and things developed to the point to where cows were so important that nobody ate them anymore. And I'm not advocating meat eating or one way or the other, but things in the Pacific Northwest, salmon were sacred, the ocean is sacred, the sun is sacred, because it damned well kept you alive, you know. And we don't have a lot of sacred things in the world anymore. And when we do, they're taken advantage of by somebody who's got a product to sell. You know, sex, drugs, rock and roll, music, all those things, food. If it's really important, then somebody is trying to find an angle on how to be the middleman between you and what's important. And that's really unfortunate. And that, I mean, the dawn of civilization kind of came about with the dawn of agriculture. People were able to produce large amounts of food in a way that it could be stored, and all of a sudden you had influence over everybody else because you had food. You know, it's the end all be all. You can't live without it. So you're able to build governments, and you're able to make all these dogmas and rules, because if they don't follow them, then you don't get the food. So that's what kicked off government, civilization, and all those things. Before that, you went out and you found your own food, and that was it depended on a great deal of competence in you, but the reward was freedom. And I tend to think that maybe we didn't get the best trade in the bargain all the way, or maybe there's a happy medium that could be found.
It certainly brings up a whole new perspective of freedom. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Maybe truth and justice too. Well,
yeah, you don't get away with anything in the real world. Things come back on you, probably with a much swifter justice than we're used to in a lot of regards. But I think also, you know, I think humans, back to the human thought question, we are so disconnected from each other that we think that, you know, when the big one hits, or when the so-called shit hits the fan, we're all just going to go cannibal and steal from each other and just go absolutely nuts, and it's just going to be total mayhem. And I know from personal experience, and I have friends who work for FEMA, and an uncle who works for Red Cross, and have been through a few disasters myself. Every time I have been in a community that's going through something rough, they come together like nothing else. It ends up being a peak experience for the people not most directly affected by it. It's not a zombie apocalypse. It's people coming together and counting on each other and becoming interdependent. And I mean, I think that is, you know, the kind of reality check that we need to have as a culture. We're freaking afraid of each other, and we're not willing to open up to each other. We're not willing to open up to the person we're married to as deeply as we probably should. And allowing yourself to be open and vulnerable, you know, more often than not pays off. It's the greatest reward. And when you think, you know, bad things do happen to people, but it's not usually because we opened up to each other. It's more probably because we recoiled in fear, or didn't take that risk, or whatever. For the most part, we live pretty darn easygoing lives, And the thing that we fear, I think, is probably overstated. You know, if we really are insecure and afraid of connecting with other people. You know, when has that really come off as being such a bad thing in your life? All the most beautiful experience in my life come from being open. Every single one of them. So I think I'm learning that myself more and more these days. But it's true. It's how we derive meaning from life.
Yeah, I'd say trust is a big issue in our culture.
Yeah.
And yeah, I like what you're saying, because it sounds like also an aspect of real community.
Mm-hmm.
Because you would be trusting on a different level, on a more basic level, and it would build from there, I would think.
Yeah. And in permaculture, the word community extends beyond humanity.
Go ahead and define permaculture. Yeah.
So permaculture, there's almost kind of a hobby among certain people to try and come up with a definition for it, because it's such a broad topic. My definition for it is designing synergy within living systems. And those living systems happen to include humans. So if you go out into the natural world and observe a given species of tree, if you know a few things of that tree, you're also going to know that you're probably going to find this particular species of bird and this particular species of mushroom. And there's this little guild of species that tend to like to be around each other, because that bird likes those seeds and that fungus likes those roots, that root system. And a gentleman coined the term permaculture down in Tasmania, I believe it was, back in the 70s. Bill Mollison, he was working as a field biologist, and he recognized this particular tree and these wombats that lived under it and these 2 or 3 other species, that he always found them together. And it just dawned on him that, oh wait, I can put these things together and engineer that system and make it happen. And he's not the one who came up with that concept. Humanity has been doing it for eons and eons and eons. We, in the Amazon, for example, still to this day has a higher proportion of food edible, essentially fruit and nut trees that were selected for by the people who lived there for eons. And the whole of North America, the native people who lived here, had really sophisticated ways of utilizing fire, harvesting game, selecting basket materials. And you just find that point within the big machine of nature that you can tweak a little bit to make things more efficient, more productive, and then you let it happen, instead of the way we do things now, which is we mow the lawn, or we hire somebody to mow the lawn, we do we find all these things that need our work, our money, and our time, when there might be some other element of the system that can do those things for us. And do we really need that mown lawn in the first place? And what are we going off of our own needs, or are we going off of how we grew up or what we were told? And the mown lawn being a great example, that comes from a time when we kept pastured animals, and if you had short cropped green grass around your house, it meant you had animals around your house keeping it that way, and that meant some measure of wealth. And now it's brought into the modern world where we have machines spew pollution into the air to do that same thing. But so back to permaculture. Permaculture is about being that observant, humble person who is taking in these things and seeing how things work before they have the idea on what they'd like to see. They've taken in the information on what can and should happen and the easiest way to make it happen without taking outside resources. So builds humility into you, because if you don't recognize the fact that water runs downhill and the wind blows from this direction and I've got these birds doing this thing, you're not going to have successful designs. You need to humble yourself to the laws of nature and the habits of your place and customize your thinking patterns to that place, or you won't be successful at it. So,
going back to our person who stays in that little tiny right corner, can you give some examples of a smaller step somebody might take to get where they could be more humble and aware? Because it sounds like a slowing down process of mind and pace and
probably a good place to start is to know with absolute certainty that you're fallible. I guess would be to go into the world and know that you're not God and that you don't have the rights to every single thing and that you might be wrong on occasion, and that the more humble or the more in touch with that absolute fact you are, the less true it's going to be. The less often you will be wrong, and the less often you'll have a negative influence on the things and people around you. So I'm thinking about, okay, somebody who grew up in the city and wants to have more of a connection with nature. It really just comes down to spending time there and being quiet, taking it in. It's a really good meditation to go out and there's actually a great meditation. It's called, I don't even know everybody calls it a meditation, but find a sit spot. Find a place in nature where you're going to go and you're going to sit for a half an hour every single day, if possible, once a week if not possible, in the rain, in the sun, however committed you want to be. The more committed the better. And your only job is to observe every single event you can, and ideally you're doing this out in nature. But how many birds did I hear? How much, what's the quality of the light today? Birds is always a great thing to focus on because they're so flamboyant, and see, how far away is the farthest bird that I can hear? How near will they come to me? How many species did I see this month as compared to last month? And the seasons change, and find one place and watch how different it is every single day. There's more going on in the 1 acre of woods behind my house than there is in 10 city blocks of New York City. But it's all subtle. It's not trying to make its presence known. It's not trying to advertise at you. It's not, it's not blaring in internal combustion engines. But there's more. It's a very, very complex place. And the more you're able to go to a place every day, maybe at different times of the day, and take in exactly how complex it actually is and see how deep down that rabbit hole you can go, the more able you'll be able to do it in any situation. So I think that's a very useful tool, the sit spot, or some people call it the medicine spot. Find a place off your back porch or maybe a half-mile walk from where you live, where a corner of a city park, where things are happening on their own, and your only job there is to observe it. It's not anywhere near as boring as you might think it is if you're not used to spending time in nature. You realize quite quickly there's no way you can keep up with everything that's going on without a massive expansion of your brain. And I think that they say we only use like 10 or 15% of our brains. Well, I've heard of them testing Aboriginal Australians and they're still using over 60% of theirs. The human brain uses 20% of the calories that we eat, and it makes up somewhere, around a few percent of our total body mass. Nature does not allow for that kind of discrepancy without a very good reason to give 20% of the calories to any being for just a teeny, piece of its mass, you're not only going to be using 10% of it without some severe kickback from it. And I feel like that's what that other 90% of our brain is for connection. It's for noticing subtle things and keeping track of the rhythms of nature and noticing things. And I used to I've had different parts of my brain kick in that I didn't grow up with after I spent years working as an invasive weeds crew boss down in California. I did invasive weeds work for 5 years, and I spent March through September every day on my hands and knees plucking out teeny little seedlings of a particular species of weed that I needed to remove from the area. And after about 3 years of doing that work, these little seedlings that you couldn't tell apart from each other when they're right in front of your face, you can see them out of the corner of your eye from 20 feet away. Something happens, your pattern recognition in your brain changes. And I would go out, and I'm a mushroom hunter, me and a good buddy of mine who used to be the previous invasive weeds crew boss for that same crew. We would go out mushroom hunting and we would kill it. He had a 35-gallon garbage can that he'd strapped to a pack frame. And he and I would go out there with buckets in each hand in that garbage can, and we'd fill them. And with mushrooms that you couldn't see because they were underground. But we knew where they were because we were picking up on something else. So that's what we were like missing access to, is so much of our own brains that we're so darn famous for. And that's what it is. It's meant for being out and observing nature. That's how we used to eat. That's how we used to feed our own children.
So what, all the connections you're talking about, and the connections that you and your friend had with mushrooms so you could find them, that makes me think of ecology. And I'm old enough to remember Rachel Carson and Jacques Cousteau when he was young. And it seems like that word has gone out of fashion. I rarely hear it used anymore. Can you talk to the connections you're talking about and how that fits in? Has ecology, the understanding of it, evolved?
I don't know that ecology, except for a small segment of the population, became anything more than a concept, anything more than an abstraction. And it needs to be a connection in order to be meaningful. So I still talk about it a lot when I'm teaching. It's the all it is the admittance that everything interacts with each other out there. It's not such a huge leap, but and that we are included in that everything. So, but it gets back to like it was a concept in our brains and not a reality to our existence. Not an immediate one, at least, that we weren't covering up with more thought. So, ecology, you talk about Jacques Cousteau and Rachel Carson. Who can you think of in the world who was more lit up than those two people? Yeah, that's right. Why is that? How much of their brain were they using? And they still were very much in that academic world. But that's why I'm lit up, is because of my time I spent with my grandparents and my dad and my mother picking huckleberries out on Mount Spokane, and those times that I thank God I got when I was a youngster are formative, and they do become a habit, I think. But I've had times since that were just as formative, like that several years pulling weeds all day every day, or living in a cabin and having to make all my own firewood, and those moments, which I think are thought of as like hard work by most modern people, were freaking rewarding, and they kept me strong and healthy and competent. And we put kids through 16 years of school nowadays and graduate a bunch of full-grown infants. We have people with a lot of ideas in their heads and not a whole lot of practical, direct experience. And back in the day, you were already feeding 2 or 3 kids at that age, and you were feeding them by your wits, and with help from your grandparents who lived in the same home, the same shelter as you, and everybody spent the end of the day hearing each other through their own ears, ear to mouth directly, and sitting around a fire. This is our genetics, to sit around the fire at the end of every day, share a meal, and listen to and talk about how your day went, or what you needed to learn, or singing songs, or telling stories. And now we sit around the flickering light and we listen to stories. We call it a television. That's why we watch 3.5 hours of television every single day. It's like this shadow of a memory of this thing that we are healthfully addicted to, not the television, but listening to each other. And sitting in front of, if you listen, learn anything about different brainwave states that you can go into and all that, when you sit in front of a fire and listen to stories, your brain drops into a different state that's very absorbent. It's very ready for learning and taking in. Whereas opposed to if you're building something or performing a task, that's a totally different brainwave state. And that's we tend to learn now through text, through reading, and that puts us in that other more focal, you could say masculine brainwave state, and that affects how we use the information later on. But The Alphabet versus the Goddess is a really fascinating book on that subject. I can't recommend it highly enough.
Leonard Shlain.
Yeah, Dr. Leonard Shlain. Yeah. He's written a couple other titles I'd really like to tear into sometime. But it is funny and ironic to recommend a book for how reading affects the mind. But read it. So yeah.
Okay.